Long before this Samaritan woman met Jesus at the well, other people had already told her who she was. What happens when the story we've believed about ourselves is interrupted by someone who truly sees us?
Welcome to Perspectives, a podcast where the clergy women of the First United Methodist Church of San Diego share their musings on scripture, theology, and what it has to do with us.
Welcome to Perspectives. I'm Reverend Hannah. I'm here with Sheilah Cameron, Director of New Life Counseling Center. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming, and you've been on this for 5 weeks.
This is the
week
fifth
5.
one. Yes.
So I appreciate you sharing your expertise and your knowledge.
Of course.
As we continue our series on taking care of mind, body, and spirit, which
Yes.
is important.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about, we care about our physical health and financial stability and all the other health.
Mm-hmm.
But we often do not think about taking care of our identity.
Mm-hmm.
So today we'll be looking at the story from John chapter 4 about this Samaritan woman and her encounter with Jesus as we talk about identity.
Mm-hmm.
So here is how the story goes in John chapter 4, verses 7 through 19 first, and then 27 through 29. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you'd have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet." Just then, several verses later, it goes, "Just then, his disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with a woman, but no one said, 'What do you want?' or 'Why are you speaking with her?' Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. And she said to the people, 'Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?'" That's how the story ends.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that was striking for me in this text is Jesus' multiple boundary crossing.
Yes.
And he engages in this conversation without asking about all those things that you ask before taking any patients.
Mm-hmm.
Your gender, your age,
Yes.
your identity, and all these other things.
Mm-hmm. How you view yourself,
Yes.
right? How you situate yourself in the world.
Yes. Instead of figuring out who she was, Jesus jumps into a conversation and asking her to give him a water. So he's asking for a favor. So here I see that he's not trying to fix her, but he respects this lady
Uh-huh.
with dignity
Yes.
and just approach her.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder whether identity is how identity is played out in relationship like this one, brand new relationship, new encounter, or how it's played out in our social relationship. So we often talk about caring for our mind, body, and spirit. So where does identity fit into that picture?
Yeah. Humans are wired for both identity formation and belonging. So we need to know who we are, but then we also need to know that we are accepted.
Oh, yes.
That's a big part of the human experience. And when either of those two things are threatened, then that could impact almost all aspects of our life.
Yes.
We're focusing on mind, so the mind we can experience anxiety
Yes.
and depression. We can turn to people pleasing for that acceptance and to understand who we are in relation to those around us. There can be perfectionism, constant comparing ourselves,
Yes.
and even confusion about our self-worth. So that's the mind aspect of it. The internal question could be, am I enough?
Yes.
Right? And then the body, we could struggle physically if we don't have a good sense of identity and feeling accepted. We could have chronic stress, sleep problems, exhaustion, eating disorders, body shame, the list goes on and on. Addictions, overall nervous system dysregulation. That's often the symptom that shows up in my office first. Sometimes people don't even understand what thoughts they have. It's more like there are these physical ailments or physical symptoms. And so we can do a body scan. Where do you feel it? Oftentimes I do have to refer to doctors, making sure there's not an actual medical diagnosis and an issue within their body. But sometimes what's going on in our mind and our spirit shows up physically. And then spiritually, people who are feeling disconnected from identity and connection with others, they might feel disconnected from God or ashamed. They might fear rejection. They might feel spiritually numb. So that's how I see it.
Yes.
With mind, body, and spirit.
Yes. And in order to cope with this fragmentation and
Yes.
disintegration of your body, mind, and spirit, when your identity is put into question and your belonging is not welcomed. I've noticed that in this story, this lady seemed to have developed a strategy for surviving. So she knew how to handle conversations. First of all, she went to draw water at the peak of the sunlight when no one else comes. So that's the first strategy. And the second strategy is to shut down the conversation. She is living with a man. She had 5 husbands, but her answer was, I have no husband. So she knows how to protect herself.
Yeah. She leads with that.
Yes, by creating that story.
Yeah.
And then that was the quickest way to end uncomfortable conversations for her, and so that she won't have to deal with extra explanations or judgments from people or awkward questions. Who is this person? Or many of us do similar things. We choose to share or not to share stories when our identity is questioned and when our belonging is threatened. And we learn how to manage other people's expectations by choosing to share certain parts of us that feels safest. Sometimes a little victim story and to cause pity on us. Sometimes we're not just telling other people's stories. We sometimes start believing that what others
Have
talk
told
about
us.
us is who we really are.
We take on how people talk about us or how they view us. Sometimes we take on those narratives.
Yes. So when we have this survival skill and our own narratives that we tweaked, and there's the narratives that other people impose on us. So, so does that disrupt a person's sense of wholeness or
Yes.
identity? And how do we face the consequences of those?
Yes, well, we have to understand that this disruption of identity and wholeness happens when painful experiences happen and when they happen repeatedly. Instead of thinking something bad happened to me, people begin to believe something is wrong with me. So identity is shaped in relationships, and identity may be also shaped by negative or adverse experiences, particularly early in life. And those negative experiences might be things like childhood neglect, inconsistent caregiving, abuse, trauma, rejection, bullying, racism, divorce, addiction, chronic criticism. So all of those things could shape how grounded we are in our identity. Jesus gently separates the woman from her story. And it sounded like he understood that her worth wasn't in her story in this verse. He acknowledges her history, but then he doesn't shame her for it. That's what I hear in this verse.
Yes. You're so right. And when Jesus asked her about her husband, he sort of seemed to know where she's coming from, the struggles, and understand, reading the context that this lady had to come to draw water at the peak of sunlight. He knew there was something terrible in her life. And without shaming her, without pretending that it didn't happen to her either, Jesus was saying, after he heard her closing down the conversation by saying, I have no husband, he goes, what you have said is true. Affirming her story without shaming, without guilt tripping, without further proving what had happened.
He affirmed her. He validated her experience.
Yes. So he was able to meet her where she was and continue the conversation. So she realizes that she's finally with someone who knows her story, but isn't reducing her to her past trauma.
Yes. And how healing that could be to then have somebody witness that or know that about you and not turn away from you.
Yes. So that moment became a healing moment. So with that, I was wondering, how do shame, trauma, or exclusion shape the internal stories people live by? And how can we better deal with those internal stories that haunt us?
Yes. Everyone lives by an internal narrative. It's essentially stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how the world operates. Trauma and shame don't just create painful memories, they often become identity statements. So instead of thinking or saying, I experienced rejection, one might start believing like I'm unlovable. Instead of saying things like, oh, I failed in that circumstance, people might believe I am a failure. Do you see how that internal script goes? It's not just about the experience, it then becomes an internalized process. And it gets worse. Yeah, and so we internalize it. And those things aren't meant for us to internalize and create our identity around. Those are just circumstances and experiences in our life. Instead of, I was abused, people might say, I believe I deserved it. So these identity statements could create then core beliefs. And core beliefs it's the lens we see the world through. It's how we believe, it's what we believe about ourselves, others in relationship with us, and just how the world operates. So there's these internal narratives that then create core beliefs. And An example of core belief is if a child experiences criticism, the core belief could be, I'm not enough. If someone experiences abandonment, they might believe that people always leave. People will never stay. If someone experiences abuse, people might think the world is unsafe. Right? And so then we behave according to those internal scripts and those core beliefs in which we see the world. So essentially is the world a safe place or an unsafe place?
That sounds like so unfair, vicious cycle of how others perceive of you and how you internalize that. And that's how you view the world, and that goes
It's
on
a cycle.
and on. Yeah.
And usually those internal dialogues, those narratives and those core beliefs are subconscious. So unless we can be very aware of what our thoughts are, and usually we do that either through journaling practices or in relationship with others, we just go around holding these beliefs and these ideas of ourself as if it's just true. When we start to externalize these things, then we get to kind of tweeze it apart and start being curious about these things. Is it based in truth, or is this just based in negative circumstance? Is there problem-saturated stories that might have some cracks in it? Is there a different way of reframing this?
Based on what you have shared, I just can't, it gives me chill how Jesus broke that pattern by affirming her.
Yeah.
What you have said is true. And then he begins by seeing her. He begins the relationship. He resets the relationship or her expectations by seeing her as who she was. And her circumstances hasn't changed. And she's still Samaritan. She's still a woman. She cannot delete the fact that she had 5 husbands, and the one she's with is not her husband, but as the same person, but whose identity is affirmed.
Yeah.
She goes back to the same village and talking to those people who had shaped the stories that she came to internalize. So I think she began to see herself differently and started breaking that vicious cycle that has haunted her for a long time. So what helps those stories begin to loosen or change?
Well, research shows that the healing happens in safe relationships. We are relational beings. So it often happens in those safe relationships. We change when we experience new corrective experiences that challenge those negative narratives, those old problem-saturated stories, or that challenge those core beliefs. So these corrective experiences could include just being vulnerable in secure relationships. Therapy, of course, healthy community, honest, vulnerable conversation, practicing self-compassion. And when I say practicing is very intentional, consistent practice. It's not a one and done thing, right? To reaffirm ourselves and challenge those negative identities. Also grieving losses, spiritual practices, and experiencing God's grace. Jesus offers those 3 things to her, right? He sees her, he says, I know your story. He stays with her and he doesn't walk away. So he's not scared or repelled by everything she's experienced or who she is. And he offers that living water to her.
What a beautiful transformation and healing that's happening in this ancient story. And I noticed that she was leaving the water jar behind. She came with the water jar, expecting to see no one in the daylight. And she runs into this man who has no judgment and who started breaking her barriers and her traumas and listening to her. So she came looking for the water. She leaves carrying purpose instead. And instead of drawing water, she's drawing people to
him.
to Jesus.
Yes.
So instead of avoiding her neighbors, she runs towards them saying, "Come and see this man."
Yes.
So throughout her life, she was avoiding people, but that changed. Her identity changes before her circumstances do. So with that story ending like that, I was wondering, what are the signs that someone is moving towards a more integrated sense of well-being or a more integrated sense of identity for you?
Well, I think that integration really means that you can accept all parts of your story without having it define our entire identity. Wounds become chapters in our life, and it doesn't become our name. So we often become more integrated when we know ourselves more honestly, when we experience less shame. That's, I think, a huge one. When we can regulate our emotions more effectively, when we develop healthier boundaries with ourselves and with others, when we become less driven by fear and approval, when we have greater self-compassion, and when we're doing all of this for ourselves, we can also do it for others. Also, when we can be more vulnerable, when we can tolerate more vulnerability, and when we become more connected with God and others, and ultimately when we're also connected more deeply with our values.
As I was listening to your story today, I was thinking about all those first few years after I moved to the U.S., where my whole identity was shaken up and my sense of belonging was challenged.
Yes.
And I could see all those issues now,
Yes.
but not then, emerging in different corners. And how I try to see the world into my perspectives and how I try to squeeze God in my life.
Yeah.
But over time, over the past 30 years or so, I was able to shift the story and shift my identity from being a Korean American international student to being a beloved child of God,
Yeah.
and placing my story in God's eternal life, so that I see where I am coming from and where I'm heading. So that actually shifted my understanding and how I interact in relationship with others. So
Yes. It's like that primary identity. That identity wasn't so much about being a Korean American. That's important, but it went
part of the
yes,
whole.
it's part of the whole. But then this primary identity was being a child of God. In reflecting on our talk today, I was remembering as a young therapist, I was working at a community agency, and I had to do 52 weeks of anger management. I facilitated anger management classes for men who were getting out of the prison system.
Wow.
There was a man that was sitting in my group for 52 weeks, and he had been in prison for 25 years. And so to really do a lot of that work, that was part of their probation and integrating back into society.
Wow.
And there was a lot of integrating back into society. Can you imagine 25 years in prison, technology changes, men didn't know what a cell phone, how to use a cell phone. You know, they didn't know what was going on in media. So there was a lot of also, our work was not only anger management and going through anger management issues, but it was really breaking down and understanding what was their internal narrative about themselves.
Wow.
What were they holding on to? And it was really past identities about what their struggle was like in their upbringing or gang affiliation, what people told them they were. And there was also a lot of shame based on what they had done. So a lot of that work was like what we're talking about here is actually where are we forming our identity? And uncoupling from some of the shame
Yes.
and the things that actually aren't part of their identity.
Yeah.
So it was important and powerful work and transformative work for me to be a part of.
Yeah. Wow. What a powerful story. Every time I sit down talking to you, I learn something new and something different. And I appreciate having a conversation with you. So thank you so much for being part of this podcast for 5 weeks. And remembering all the lessons that I've learned from your conversation with other pastors, I've come up with a few questions for others, our listeners, to ponder upon. And you can approve or disapprove. So what labels have you carried for so long that you've mistaken them for your identity? Are you spending more energy protecting your reputation than nurturing your identity? And what would change if you truly believed you are fully known and fully loved? These are good questions.
I approve of them.
Thank you. And I invite all our listeners to either think about those questions or have a conversation with your friends or whoever is surrounding you with these questions. And we thank you so much for listening to our talk and hope to see you again. Thanks.
This is a production of First United Methodist Church of San Diego. To learn more about our events and ministries and to access additional learning resources, visit fumcsd.org.